Well, welcome everyone to our next sessions. We obviously have a panel discussion here, and then we're going to go straight into a workshop. So we'll explain more about that when it comes, but that's what the tables at the back are for, and we're very excited. So without further ado, I'd like you to put it together and give it over to Bill Yotive. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Philippe. So this session is going to focus on the gaps that remain and visions for the future. So again, going back to my remarks earlier, this all fits into establishing where we are and where we want to go. Some of this has come up in previous sessions and speakers in terms of identifying some gaps, but I want to focus in now in this panel in a more focused way on where we are, and a part of understanding where we are is understanding where are the gaps, identifying those gaps, and then also, once we've identified them, speaking about what are some of the solutions of how we can close whatever gaps we identify. Now, the idea of gaps is very broad, so I want to kind of structure the conversation as much as possible to think about different categories of gaps. What are some of the different categories of gaps? One of them is gaps between Model UN and the UN itself. We've brought some of that has come up a little bit, but I want to see if we can explore that a little bit more. Another area is gaps within Model UN itself. What are some of the differences and gaps within Model UN that we need to explore and then find solutions to? Another gap are gaps between Model UN and civil society. We saw that in the resolution, it calls for civil society to support and promote Model UN. But how do they do that? What needs to be done? Where are the gaps between Model? And I spoke before, from my perspective, one of the gaps are that we find that civil society is not covering Model UN in the way that it did in its early history. That's an example of a gap. And then the fourth area of the gap is the gap between Model UN and the academic or educational community. And I think we'll hear a little bit about that as well. So those are some areas. It's not just talking broadly about gaps, but trying to have a more structured conversation. So I'm very pleased to have this panel today, a very esteemed panel, very experienced panel. And now we will introduce them, and then we will give the floor to them to hear their point of view. The first speaker to my left is a good friend of mine, Kevin Chan, also known as KFC, because his name is Kevin Felix Chan. That's how we've always referred to him. He's the co-founder and CEO of Best Delegate. Kevin has personally taught Model UN in 20 countries around the world and spoken twice at the United Nations. We then have Audre Park. Hi, Audre. I didn't get a chance to say hello to you yet, but welcome. She's the founder of Global Minds LLC. Audre is passionate about providing opportunities to children to learn about global issues. Prior to being an immigration attorney, she was a 9th grade English teacher. In 2015, as a volunteer parent, she brought the Model UN program to her daughter's schools as a way to enhance their global perspective. Then we have Nadine Khaouli, welcome, who works at the UN Development Program that we refer to as UNDP in New York as a youth engagement coordinator for the Generation 17 initiative. She credits her experience as a UN volunteer in Lebanon for giving her leadership opportunities, which prepared her to this role. Then we have Wannes Lint. Hello, Wannes. Welcome. Wannes is an Intergovernmental Affairs Officer in the Secretariat of the United Nations General Assembly. He leads in the General GA Secretariat for the Summit of the Future, the Global Digital Compact, the General Committee, the Ad Hoc Working Group on GA Revitalization, the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, and the 11th Emergency Special Session on the Ukraine. So as you can see, we have a very esteemed panel, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Felix Chan. I did Model UN as a student. I started off as one of those students who was super shy and nervous, and then did it in high school and university, got to speak at the actual UN, introduced then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. So I recognized the power of Model UN to really change people's lives and help them become confident global leaders. And now as Best Delegate, we work with thousands of students around the world, have done projects across 20 different countries, high school, middle school, university, and elementary school levels. Worked with a variety of organizations, including UNODC, UNDP in India, the UAE Ministry of Education with WFUNA, so all sorts of organizations in the space. And we're also a certified B Corp, which means we meet certain social sustainability and environmental performance standards. So I give that background because from my perspective, I'm going to share things that are about how do we look at Model UN from a very strategic and systemic way. The big picture that I get to see because I've done this around the world. So when we talk about accessibility, financial and logistical, I frame it against, I believe around the world, there are over 600 million students that are in the K-12 age, I believe. I think something around that, over 600 million. So if we think about those that can actually maybe do Model UN as it currently is structured, which is probably high school, university, and middle school, that's probably maybe half the number, 300 million. So 1% of that is 3 million. I don't think there are 3 million students doing Model UN today. I'm not sure, right? So we are less than 1% of the world population doing Model UN, or the student population. So there's a big gap. And the reason why is I think Model UN is currently framed as an extracurricular activity, not a curricular program, because the curricular program would reach 100% of students. So when we talk about accessibility and funding, it comes down to, do governments, ministries of education, value Model UN enough that they would actually fund the program or make it part of the program? That is the most fundamentally most scalable, accessible way to make Model UN. And so when we talk about the future, vision of the future, if somehow all of us can lobby all our governments to say Model UN should be a part of the curriculum in some form or fashion, that would enable it, middle school, high school, elementary school, university, and how to get the cost structure down, which fundamentally reimagines what Model UN looks like. Because right now it's a conference that we all have to go to instead of the simulation coming to them at their schools, right? If Model UN only costs, for example, $1, which is low for US standards, but if you go to other countries, $1 is a lot. So how do you get Model UN to cost that? Right now, it probably costs maybe $1,000 for a student to come to New York, go to a Model UN conference. So there's a big gap right there. That's a 1,000x difference. Two other quick comments is Model UN is an activity that, for better or worse, requires critical mass. There needs to be a lot of students to show up, even 30 students minimum to just get a simulation going, right? And there are a lot of geographies where it's hard to find 30 students who are interested in this topic or to get the training for it. So how do we normalize Model UN in different ways, in different countries, different languages? How do we normalize virtual Model UN being a default way of doing Model UN? Because in certain cities or schools, there just aren't enough students that are interested in these topics. And how do we build trust by bringing Model UN to them and doing topics that are relevant to them versus trying to get them to come to us? Even earlier, when a lot of the people said, we need youth to come to the table, that to me is a different reframe in my mind because it's more about how do we bring the table to them, right? Because it's not our every day as a student, we cannot afford to come to the table. We are busy at school. So that is one reframe. And the last one I noticed is because I'm also on the boards of several nonprofits, it's the scarcity versus abundance mindset. And scarcity mindset pervades a lot of the nonprofit space. Another way to say this is competition versus collaboration. One of the most amazing things about this whole summit and everyone who's here is we are all trying to collaborate. And collaboration, unfortunately, is not the default in the Model UN world. The conferences do not collaborate with each other. They're all independent entities running on their own. In fact, they're competing with each other. Why? Because financial reasons, they are trying to get critical mass to come to their conference. And if one student can afford to go to one conference, they won't go to another's, right? So the fundamental financial system hinders natural collaboration in Model UN. And we're competing for dollars. But because we're competing, conferences continue to differentiate themselves rather than standardize. So therefore, they're coming up with all sorts of creative, crazy crisis simulations, procedures, et cetera, to differentiate themselves. So I share this because it's all these hidden forces that we don't see that's actually creating the opposite effect. So how do we make collaboration to the norm? And part of collaboration requires sustainability and consistency. And that requires people to be around. Naturally, students will graduate after a few years, so there's lack of consistency, right? Why is this summit able to be possible? Because these individuals have been working behind the scenes to lobby the United Nations for several years before this resolution was adopted. So it does require professionals to be part of the process. And somebody mentioned earlier about commercialization and different entities getting into it. That's part of sustainability. We think about UN SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. There has to be entities that help drive the growth of Model UN and understand finances to make it sustainable in the long run and to grow the whole system. So that's some of my comments. And I think Model UN creates a very powerful alumni network. How do we make the alumni part of the process so that we extend the life cycle of Model UN beyond just the student years?
Thank you very much, Kevin. I apologize, I left out our next speaker, so let me introduce her. Giulia Tariello is from Italy. She's an EU Youth Delegate for the UN General Assembly 78th session. Previously, she served as the Italian Youth Delegate to the United Nations, thanks to the program of the Italian Society for the International Organization, where she focused on advancing the Sustainable Development Goal of quality education. During this role, she advocated for reforming education systems globally and ensuring equitable access to education. Giulia.
Thank you very much, and no worries for the presentation. I'm glad to be here and participate in this panel and see the audience today. I prepared my points, but I don't think that they really, I think you made some really important points today. And reflecting on the barriers, other than my work as a youth delegate, I am a secretary in MSOE, the Student Movement for the International Organization, and is the only youth association that is recognized by the WFUNA in Italy. So I'm glad to meet you. And in the next few days, we will have a simulation game on the Security Council in Milan. And reflecting on what are the challenges that we experienced in organizing this simulation game. And the first one is the language barrier. I was speaking with my colleagues before, and I was a bit more silent than them because I acknowledge that for me, English is a barrier. Even if I'm speaking at the UN, still, I feel more comfortable in reading what I wrote rather than improvise. So when we were thinking, how is it better if we organize our simulation game in Italian or in English? We took a hard decision to have the simulation in Italian, even if then it would be more complicated for the delegates, for example, to find relatable documents on the topic of the simulation, and even for the organizers to prepare and draft the position papers and to adapt of the actual how the Security Council works and to adapt it in Italian. But we realized that having a simulation game or MUN in English this don't allow people that don't speak English to participate in the simulation game. I mean, also now we are speaking English and there is no translation. So maybe other people that don't know English can't participate. And of course, that's the same in the UN. During this week, I was at the UN for the Commission on the Status of Women. And of course, of course, for the liquidity crisis, not all the conference rooms had the translation. So that was a bit frustrating to know that there were delegates that couldn't fully understand what was being said. Another barrier is the economic barrier. Our simulation game we didn't ask for any fee to participate, but of course only associates for our in MSOE will have the opportunity to attend. And we have an annual fee, which is just 10 euros, but still it's a fee, an economic barrier. But I know that most of the simulations are like the required delegates to pay a fee, and sometimes it's a high fee. And another point is that most of the simulations are happening in New York. And for the whole week, I was looking for free receptions to go and have free drinks and food, because New York is not a cheap city. I think it's really also important to reflect on the language and economic barrier to allow more and more young people to participate in those MUN, and as the colleague mentioned, also start implementing more hybrid MUNs, but not unfortunately now we are not seeing the online attendance. So it would be great also to know who are those attendants and have a better interaction with them. And the last point is, of course, I'm a youth delegate, so I'm part of an actual delegation, a real diplomatic delegation at the UN. And so I have this both perspective of a person that is organizing MUNs and still being a delegate. And I acknowledge that there is a huge gap between those two worlds. Because I have knowledge of how to organize a simulation of the Security Council only because I attended a real session of the Security Council. But I'm privileged. And not all the young people are, or not just young people, every person, not everyone has the opportunity to attend a real session of the Security Council or the General Assembly. So it's also important to provide trainings to the organizers, to the speakers, and to the delegates, pre-trainings of the sessions. And have more interactions between the delegation, the proper delegations, and the simulated ones. I was really happy once I received the invitation, because I thought, okay, I have this privilege to sit in the General Assembly and in the conference rooms. And I think it's important to bring also this perspective in this panel. But I wanted to conclude saying that even if I have the privilege to sit there, I think that the work of the delegations during the simulation games or MUNs are even more hard and important, because you have all these preparation sessions, the position paper drafting, and the studying of the topic that I don't have. I prepared for the CSW, but I think that those who attend the simulation games are more hardworking, maybe. They work in different ways. But I hope that was useful. And I thank you again.
I'm sorry. Yeah, should I go next? I think they said it all, and I can pack my things and leave. No, yeah, thank you so much. And hi again, everyone. I'm Nadine. Though I am the Youth Engagement Coordinator at the UNDP headquarters in New York, I am a young leader, and I come from Lebanon, which is the most beautiful country on earth, I would say. And I'm bringing here the perspective of both the UNDP perspective, or the UNDP youth team working with youth 24/7, as well as the perspective of a previous MUNer. I think I've attended my last conference. It was, I guess, 15 years ago. We were discussing this, and I think that's where my dream of working for the UN really started. It's because I was very committed to MUN. I started as a delegate, and then as a chair, and then as a president for the sessions at my high school. So why I'm saying this? Because as Kevin said, we're bringing like real experiences, and we want to reflect on these experiences, or I want to reflect on these experiences by really stressing on the points that Giulia and Kevin mentioned, and maybe also emphasizing the idea of creating partnerships. Accessibility means access to opportunities, but also to proper infrastructure in different contexts and in different countries. Empowerment of alumni we're working with and with students, as well as networking. And I'd say the MUN really can enhance the engagement with youth coming from diverse backgrounds by offering tailored mentorship programs, and also offer updated curriculums. Updated curriculums mean also having them in different languages, so we can really be implemented in different contexts and in different communities, and making them also accessible to all the countries. I know that some of the model MUN curriculums out there are really updated and I think Audre can really stress on this, but I'm not sure if they can be offered for free, for instance, for schools, for universities who really are coming from different background and different context, and they just want to support their students and empower their students without having to really pay to get these curriculums. And also scholarships opportunities. I know that every one of us is depending on funding to continue and to sponsor and support the students that we are working with, but also scholarship opportunities can really empower the students that we're working with, so they can really come and be here with us and learn from global opportunities, not just those who are present maybe on country level and regional levels. Also, maybe support in research. I know that the MUNers really rely on research ahead of going to the session, right? And at some point, I think they need to be supported in terms of research, like collaborating with educational institutions to see how we can really best get the information needed. How can we rely on research? How can we really do the research in the most efficient way in order to have the students prepared? Also, internships at different organizations. I know that this seems a bit silly because it's hard to get internships in different organizations, but it doesn't really need to be UN organizations. Why not to have like internships in different educational institutions, and let's say the political science department or the PR department, or in different CSOs, right? This is how you really empower those committed MUNers in order to go into the real life and see how things is going on. Before, like when I was at the MUN, I learned the negotiation skills, I learned the public speaking and so on, but I'm not a delegate working for the Secretariat, right? I am working for the UNDP, and my mandate are totally different now. It's all about collaboration, partnerships, negotiation. So in case they are passionate about the MUN, it doesn't really have to just be being a delegate the ultimate goal, but maybe working for UN organizations in different and we're focusing on different sectors and in different departments. Also, like strengthening relationships with UN agencies, and I was discussing this with my colleagues before, and I know that it's hard maybe in some context to strengthen the relationship with UN agencies, but there are UN agencies based on country of or have country offices or regional offices, and these are, you know, easy to access if you want to start strengthening your relationship with the UN agencies on country office level first. And as you know, our world is evolving every day and bringing new experiences and challenges, right? But it's also critical to respond to these emerging global challenges by updating the curriculum, as I said, and agenda topics, incorporating technology for remote participation. And I'm very happy to learn that we're live streaming our session today. This is very important. However, we must also consider those who lack access to technology or connectivity, but remain passionate about creating change and impact, right? There are a lot of communities out there who don't have the proper infrastructure, the proper internet connection to participate. So we need to really think how we can be accessible and reach those communities and offer them the best solution possible in order to be with us, in order to join us, and in order to empower them, right? And to be even more accessible, as Giulia discussed, is to have the curriculums translated in different languages. And I know that some educational institutions are doing this on their own, so this is great. Why not to collaborate with these educational institutions and have them online, right? So they can really just have access to all the curriculums out there in different languages. And one last thing I'd like to really stress on is empowering MUNers. Empowering MUNers by offering TOTs, trainings of trainers, right? And really train those committed alumni in order to be in our position one day. Let them give the sessions, let them give the trainings, let them lead. I always stress on the idea that in order to give back to your community, you need to empower and you need to support those who are learning, right? Or those who are passionate about learning these things. So give back to your community by really doing or implementing the TOTs. Yeah, this is maybe in a nutshell, and I'll leave my colleagues also to reflect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next is Audre.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, to be with this panel of passionate individuals. As Bill had introduced earlier, my coming into this, I did not have MUN as an experience in school. So I first came across this when my oldest was a 5th grader. And I know that seems early, but I understood that this was possible. And I was one of those moms. I said, I wanted this for my kids. So I happened to find Global Classrooms DC, which is the educational flagship program of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. So they are the largest DC chapter, largest chapter in the US, at the DC chapter. And when I found that they had a curriculum, I brought that to my school's principal and said, I want this for my kids. And she looked at me and she's like, there is not a teacher who has time for that. And so I kind of dug down to my history, my background of being a 9th grade English teacher. And I said, give me a room, I'll do it. And so it's really about, it's one of those adages where those who don't do teach. This was a situation. And basically through that process, I was able to formulate a program. We started with 30 5th graders. 9 years later, we have myself and some very dedicated parents. We established, it's now a fee-based program, but we wanted to create a sustainable program that would allow schools who did not have teachers and didn't have crazy parents, who would be willing to provide a sustainable program. So I'm hoping that my presentation will give a little glimmer of hope, because we're talking about the gaps in MUN, And my personal experience was really that gap. How do we get the materials? Because the resources are there. How do we get this into our schools? I've been fortunate that I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. So we basically have the State Department as our background and playground. A number of UN agencies there. So there's a lot of resources there. It's making the connections. So in this process, we've had the pleasure of being able to be a part of the United Nations Department of Communications, Global Communications Program, where they have launched the Real UN and had brought members from the Secretariat, diplomat department, from field agencies, the World Food Program, to come into our schools and make Model UN, make UN real and relatable in a way that could not be seen otherwise. It was just very, very theoretical idea, and come to find out from Bill that we're actually in our conferences kind of very far away from what the UN looks like. We, our students very much believe in the voting process, and for them to be found out that there needs to be consensus is going to completely change everything, I guarantee you. So I can't wait to go back and tell them this news. But it's showing that the sources are there, and now with the passage of the resolution in the General Assembly 77336, I think it establishes a greater push on our UN agencies to be involved in the outcome of what happens in our Model UN programs. So the glimmer of hope is this. We have the agencies, we have the opportunities to. For me and our organization, we hope to be able to expand by placing instructors into schools. We have the fortune of having a school district who's already in a way implemented Model UN into part of their curriculum, be it only for a week or 2 weeks. They're giving them a taste of that. But the second part is being able to find that connection and that commitment between their schools, both academically and in terms of support and personnel, to be able to bring the curriculum that's already there. So I failed to mention I'm also on the board of directors of the UNA-NCA. And what they've done is they've created conferences that will allow students and schools in the area to be able to participate on the level, to interact with officials and with the UN officials in our area. So they do that both in the fall and also in the spring. We actually take over the State Department, and they have access to officials on the grounds to be able to see and to make sure that their simulation is looking more and more like what it really is in the UN. So that's there's definitely the processes there. We're hoping also that we can see this type of partnership that happens. Bill had alluded to the twinning process. That's in terms of an economical sharing of being able to pull one school that needs assistance into with another one that has, by also doing that with the number of high schoolers that we have in our area. We've seen that happen where maybe 2 very dedicated students will go over to a middle school and try and run their organization, but there lacks a little bit of cohesion for them to be able to carry that knowledge on once those students graduate. So I think that's kind of like on the forefront of the next being, is that we're seeing some kind of collective cohesion where we see students who will be able to form a part of an organization to pass that baton down, to know that this school, this high school is going to buddy with another, elementary school or a middle school or another high school that actually doesn't have that formation. We've seen it work. We just know that there needs to be some kind of sustainable program to be able to keep it collective. So I think that where we are, we're progressing. We're in a good place, but we definitely need to see those partnerships continue. We've had the privilege this year, I'm speaking with the hat on as board of directors for UNA-NCA, to see the work that's been done with the International Organization of Migration, International Labor Organization, where they started they did a conference this year, their first, for college students and high school students. And that was really novel in the sense that the chairs were working well with those organizations to be able to provide a more real-like simulation of what the ILO is and the IOM. So we're seeing those trends, and we like to see some more of that, and that's really, to the dedication of nonprofit organizations like the UNA, who want to see this come to fruition. They're now celebrating their 20th year. I have a group of about 38 students who are going to be attending the State Department's ModUN conference in April. So they're getting ready for that. But we would like to be able to see a little bit more of that. And I know that the groundwork is there, and we can continue to progress towards that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last guest speaker, Wannes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks for the organizers for the invite. My name is Wannes Lint. I work in the Secretariat of the General Assembly, and it's about, I want to say, 12 years ago that I graduated from Model UN to non-Model UN. It was quite an interesting transition to see, from my own Model UN experience. I helped organize the European Model United Nations in Maastricht in the Netherlands. For those of you who have attended, welcome here. For those of you who have not, we're still running Model United Nations, and it's one of the nicer conferences that we have in Europe. So, of course, you're warmly invited. What I recognized was that, in fact, Model United Nations very much is the real deal. It is very much how negotiations happen at the United Nations. And before we talk about the gaps of Model UN, and I'll zoom in specifically on the question that Bill asked, gaps between sort of the real UN, if there's such a thing, and the Model United Nations that are being organized in different places, let's first just give a shout out to all organizers who recreate a UN-like a conference diplomacy atmosphere in which something happens that is as real as the real thing, and that we don't really have to shy away from. If you look at, say, social aspects and how relationships come into play at Model United Nations, if you talk about how you apply negotiation strategy, and I'm not talking about what you find in books, but just how it happens in a room like this one. You read about a Batna or a Golden Bridge, and then you try to apply one in practice and see how some of that actually works. The exhaustion that can come in after a few days of talking about a particular issue, and you still want to make progress in one sort of form or shape. The elbow work that you see some delegates put forward just to try to get their own national positions on it. All of that is very much reflexive of how conference diplomacy works in reality as well. And of course, for many people, MUN is an introduction to, for the first time, representing a position that might not be theirs, which to me is one of the most fundamental aspects of this world, of these simulations, of these games, as some of my fellow panelists have called them, just to recognize that it can be a position that is very different from yours. Now, talking about gaps, and in Resolution 77-336, you see a plea to MUN societies to make MUNs more authentic. I think authenticity is important, but if there's one thing I hope you take away from the few minutes I have, is that authenticity comes in many different forms and shapes. One of my fellow panelists has already mentioned this concept of modalities. We just talked about decision-making rules, doing things by consensus, having a voting machine. Well, the entire United Nations conference building is built on different kinds of meetings and different kind of modalities. And so don't think that there is just a single way of doing something. In fact, the plea I would make here in these few minutes is that there are so many authentic conference diplomacy formats, so many different ways that you can do it. And if you're looking at what KFC referred to as critical mass, just know that very small meetings also happen at the United Nations. Sometimes you start in a conference room without any interpretation services, and that does indeed bring very particular challenges, but it allows for very early, very brittle consensus to be formed on specific issues. That's just as much UN as the UN I have the privilege of supporting from time to time, which is the big UN in the General Assembly Hall, where we can seat 1,800 people, 6 per delegation, where we can go through all the formalities as one would expect reading the rules of procedure of the General Assembly. But all of that is full UN spectrum. And I think it helps when you think about how do you scale this, right? Just not to think of this as a conference that must have 600, 700, 800, sometimes 1,500 participants. That's not necessary to create part of the UN. You can really start small. The second thing I would speak to is the focus on drafting and draft resolutions. If you think about a career at the United Nations, it's really useful place to start. How do you draft in a conference setting, how you go about it? A lot of this is skills building, right? How do you do negotiations? How do you reflect these ADELs? How do you deal with amendments and so on and so forth? That's an extremely useful skill. But let's not pretend that that's the only thing that happens during a negotiation. Negotiations are much about proposals and ideas and concrete implementation as much as what you see on a screen. And just drawing from my own MUN experience, I sometimes wish that these discussions had been more inclusive of that too. What would happen after a resolution is adopted? What is the Secretariat going to do to implement a particular resolution? How is it going to affect negotiation dynamics down the road? It's really nice to sort of, as you organize different MUNs, to also prime your delegates' minds to that specifically. It's not just about the text, but it's also, of course, about the meaning of the text and what the text is going to bring around down the road. In the General Assembly's Rules of Procedure, we have a Rule 153, which talks about the review of program budget implications. The rule says as much as that the Assembly cannot take action on a proposal until the Secretary General has advised on what the associated implications are, and until such time that the Fifth Committee, of course, which you all know as MUN organizers, has had a chance to make its recommendations on the financial implications. This was not to geek out on General Assembly Rules of Procedure, but just to say that as part of a negotiation process, we really look at these governance-related aspects in a fair amount of detail. And you can invite your delegates to do the same thing. I heard from Bill the other day that there are certain model United Nations that actually designate a budget director, which sounds, of course, quirky for a model UN, but it recognizes the fact that negotiations don't end when a resolution is adopted. No, then people do get to work and the implementation starts. Implementation can be the Secretariat performing new activities which need to be funded, hence the designation of a budget director. But it also could just mean delegates continuing their conversations in different ways. If you establish a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly to have a conversation about a particular issue, the nature of your negotiation changes. And so really a plea to invite your delegates to look at what we call at the United Nations mandates, the formulation of mandates, which are more than just text, but are things like agenda items, adding a new item to the already rather long list of agenda items of the General Assembly. It could be something as requesting the Secretary General to conduct analysis on a particular issue. It could be calling for a high-level meeting on a specific topic which should draw attention. It could be many different kind of things, but in my experience, at least at MUNs, it's often more about the actual drafting itself. So that would be one. Another one, which is maybe a reflection of this day and age, is to say, well, these days, maybe it's not as much only about national positions anymore. Many of you know that the European Union enjoys enhanced participation status at the United Nations following the adoption of a resolution. And many of you know that we have a host of observers which are invited to participate in the work of the General Assembly by observing meetings, making statements, and so on and so forth. But if you look at recent years, not that I'm claiming a trend, but rather just to see recent negotiations, you see that regional groups take a far more active role. And these are not just the European Union and the group of G77 and China, but these are all kind of coalitions and groups that are formed for particular purposes. You might see current ongoing negotiations where very purpose-specific groups have been formed to talk about specific issues during complex negotiations. That's something, of course, you can consider during your model UNs as well. Of course, EU would likely always be a player. There would be a delegate representing the European Union. And maybe for some of the more advanced MUNs, if there's such a thing, you might have a representative of the G77 in China. But it's an open question as to how you can invite these group dynamics into your negotiations. And really also not because it makes it more real, but also because it makes more interesting. Groups, of course, defend their positions, but groups are not always homogeneous. And so there might be different groups within the same groupings. There might be different perspectives that you would want to hone. And so with that, you can also make it a little bit more realistic. The very last thing I would say, and that's in recognition of 77-336 as well, there's a lot of good material out there that you can refer to as you're preparing for Model United Nations. I wish that that material would be available in languages also other than English, French, I think Spanish, Portuguese, and maybe some other languages, but they're very good starting points as you're trying to sort of enhance the caliber of some of the conversations that you're having. The guidebook, UNITAR, which is a UN organization for staff training and delegate training, have very good handbooks that you can refer to. But let none of this, in wrapping up, convey the message which I don't intend to convey, which is that you need to do this in order to have a more authentic Model United Nations. Many of your Model United Nations are already authentic enough. And if you think about their inclusivity, make them smaller, not bigger. Bring them closer to home in languages that people would speak. Make them virtual, even if in the General Assembly we no longer have any formal, or rather we never had any formal virtual meetings. Because truly the true MUN experience comes with some of these simpler modalities, some of these simpler organizational aspects, whether you are a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old at different levels of education and interest and so on. It just all starts very small. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wannes. You've made a lot of interesting comments that gives us a lot of food for thought. And I also thank our panelists for all their insights as well. Started out wanting to touch on the different categories of gaps. I think we touched on most of them, except one of them that seems to be still lacking is a better understanding of the gaps between Model UN and civil society. A lot of the barriers that were identified, language barriers, resource barriers, and so forth, are things that require funding. Funding is something that is really lacking in the Model UN community on many different levels. And I think one of the things that we need to have more discussions on is how we can get more support of civil society in our activities. That being said, we're running very late, so I want to just take a couple of questions. We have time for how many questions? 3 questions. Okay. Okay, which?
One comment. Your name is Giulia or Giulia? How do you pronounce your name? Giulia. Okay. I think that Italian language, the selection was not hard. It was the best selection, and thank you for that. So my question to you, Audre, so how your program is going on? I was just thinking that whether you did any program evaluation, because it could be very challenging sometimes to initiate a program and continue.
Next question.
I had one.
Thank you guys for all your great remarks. It was very interesting to hear. Certainly it's very inspiring for like kids like me to see people do this kind of youth representative work. My question is, there's a lot of differences drawn between Model UN as it is now and as many universities around the country and around the world do it, and what the real UN looks like. Bill, you made a lot of those points too in the last panel. My question is, if we were to reform how Model UN looks like now into a consensus-driven organization where people form into committees and try to agree with each other and produce one single document at the end of the entire conference, how do you keep that kind of Model UN still stylish, attractive, and realistic and relevant to students currently who all they're seeing in college is how to debate with other people, how to push their points forward, how to make what they argue more palatable to a populace or to a representative body that they're coming to Model UN to represent? How do you make that kind of consensus building and that kind of UN politicking palatable to college students who want to be debated, who want to be argued against, and who want to have that kind of fervor in conferences that they go to?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for coming and speaking. It's been a wonderful experience so far listening on this end, especially once again as a student and as an organizer and a competitor. But one of the things that I wanted to ask is a lot of the things you mentioned, Nadine, with scholarships and internships, the implementation of correct language, so on and so forth. A lot of these are policy points that operate from an organizer perspective. These are things that people who organize can do to close that gap. But that, as Kevin said, that 1,000 to 1 gap, that exists. It's a gap between two people, right? You have the attendees as well who need to do what they can to close that gap to try to attend. And as someone who, practically speaking, as an attendee, as a manager, or as someone who manages the finance for a team that's attending these events, what are the things that we can do? Because those are longer term solutions that take time, that take effort, that take years. In the immediate and now, as an attendee, what can I do to make it so that my team, or what resources can I access so that my team can try to close that gap on our end and turn 1,000 to 1 into a lower gap that some people can kind of cross, and we can gain attendance from an attendee perspective.
Yes. So I wrote it down, so I'm going to read off of it and make it short. I recently came across an article from Foreign Policy that discussed how UN figures reveal that a disproportionate allocation of top jobs go to Western candidates. And as someone from Turkey, I have to ask this question. We talked a lot about accessibility. And there's one barrier that involves all of that we haven't addressed, which is privilege. I'm concerned about things like UN's practice of not paying its interns, and it creates significant barriers for those who come from less wealthy, less privileged backgrounds, or people who do not have the means to even travel to another country. And while there's often talk about the inclusive nature of the UN for youth from all backgrounds like we have today, doesn't the current structure of the UN perpetuate a cycle where only voices from privileged backgrounds gain experience and visibility in the organization to make real change? And doesn't this perpetuation of privilege become counterproductive to efforts aimed at combating cynicism about United Nations among young people?
These are great questions. And also the questions online are very related to the how can we encourage greater participation for underrepresented groups, marginalized communities, and so forth. So I believe that this is one of the points that the online community is concerned about as well. And yeah, I think we can.
Thank you. So I ask our panelists to, as much as possible, keep their answers brief because we're really far behind in our schedule. So who would like to start out?
Thank you for all of your questions. I just want to reflect on the point that you made about the unpaid internships and accessibility, and I will do it from the UN Delegate program point of view. For the CSW, we were, I think, 10 youth delegates. None of them were from a country besides the EU. And also in September during the GA, this was my second year at the accreditor at the GA, and 60 delegates, most of them from European countries or the US or wealthier countries. And this is a real problem for lack of representation and, of course, accessibility to the UN system itself. What I can say from a youth delegate perspective is for the internships, yes, I would blame the UN, but still we have to remember that the UN is just a group of member states. And I cannot blame the UN for not paying internships if in Italy I'm not paid. So first we have to solve our internal issues, and then we can go to the UN or any international fora and blaming them and pretend to have to be paid. And I am advocating for banish unpaid internships within the UN and within the EU. I'm not saying that it's a right practice, absolutely not. And I see your point, of course, in how lack of representation from, I don't know, Latin American region or African region in Asia. So what we can do, I think, start advocating in our own countries on what are the best practices to involve youth within our communities. and then we can advocate for the UN. And still, the last point I want to highlight is that the UN have a fund where member states can like contribute to the fund by specifying the purpose of those money. For now, no member state has used that fund for financing youth delegates programs. Of course, all the programs have been implemented, but still, when you're actual part of the delegation and we really feel the power, and not the power, but the empowerment of young people and the engagement in those decision-making processes. So yeah, just let the member states be aware that there are these possibilities to have youth delegates program and to yes, contribute to the fund, and continue advocating in our own national basis and then to the UN.
Yes. So let me see if I can answer your question. So just to start, to be a little bit transparent, I acknowledge that the public schools that I am are come from affluent communities. And the way that we try to address making those economic, social economic equity issues is working along with our schools and also with a pretty robust PTA to identify students who have financial needs to provide scholarships. As our company, we actually provide those scholarships, and then for students who needed to attend local conferences, we would work strongly with the PTA to identify those students who needed assistance. That's the best case scenarios, right? So I'm hearing a lot of questions that a lot of your concerns are, how do we get funding to go to this? And I do know that a lot of conferences, sometimes that is like a big financial moneymaker for them. They're upping the conference fees. I do know that there are a lot of schools who are purely in the event or the experience for the purposes of their students being able to have an academic experience. And so they keep their costs really low for just the purpose of covering their expenses. So I think, to speak back to the panel previous, now with the emergence of this resolution, I think we have to make demands, Giulia, like you're saying, is that we have to go to our officials, and especially for us in the DC area, we're seeing that more, where schools who have need base are being able to make those demands and saying, listen, this is an important endeavor and we're looking for funding to meet those needs. So, for in our area where we have schools who have free and reduced meals, or Title I schools, they can actually go to UNA NCA and actually have their schools have reduced fees based on the status of their schools. So there is a process there. A lot of it is down now. We just need to be advocates of making demands on that. So.
Thanks so much. Just two quick points. The first one on unpaid internships. There are many things that are possible and there are many things that are not. I think there is plenty of space for creativity, as we show in different parts of the UN Secretariat, to be inclusive about offering internships to people all over the world, to find modalities that allow interns to participate in the work that we do and have meaningful internship experiences. I mean, in the GA Secretariat, I'm a very proud participant in these discussions to facilitate participation of people who have just graduated or in the last few years of their education and who want to get a sense of how the non-model UN actually works. It is definitely possible. It does take some creativity. Now, on the question about debating, this is how do you attract your finest debate talents to participate in a process where you make decisions by consensus? 2 points. First point, if you look at the real United Nations, the most difficult conversations are held with a consensus requirement. And the best negotiators go to these negotiations. The second point, if you want to carry that message home to those who are not aware of this or who don't feel this and who think that an Oxford-style debating, an American or a national model of debating is the highest possible standard, my recommendation would be this. Invite them to participate in 2 working groups during the Model UN on 2 different issues with different rules of procedure. The first one is formal decision-making, General Assembly plenary style, amendments, voting, what have you. And the second one is a hard consensus requirement. Lock them in a room for 3 days and ask them afterwards which experience was more challenging. I think many will say that decision-making by consensus is a whole lot more challenging. So I think this sounds rather dorky, because this is about rules of procedure and negotiation processes. But by organizing your MUN in that particular way, you can bring some of these differences out and you can carry these messages across far more effectively than by somebody sitting on a panel saying, oh, it really is that way. No, you just live that experience and then you'll probably reach the same conclusion. Thanks.
One last point, just on the question from the online. First, thank you so much, online community, for joining us. And how can we really reach out to the underprivileged communities? And that's through the partnerships with CSO organizations on community levels and through empowering them. Like at UNDP, we cannot do any project on community level without having CSO on board supporting us and delivering the best projects, the best work through the communities. So empowering CSO is a must in order to reach the underprivileged communities. And what do I mean by empowering them is by, of course, as I said, offering the trainings of trainers for these CSO organizations or even educational institution, so they can be really able to deliver back. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, quick points. One of the most scalable, sustainable, fun, attractive youth activities that are out there. If you go to actually talk to students, what do they care about? Sports, music, social media, entertainment. Of these 4, which one is most similar in model to Model UN? It's typically sports. If we follow the model of soccer or whatever sport is popular in your home country, how do we implement some of those cultures and systems into the activity so that Model UN is seen as attractive to the masses and not just to a certain small percentage of people? That's one thing to note. I do like the point about get smaller, not bigger, in order to scale. I came from a community, I did Model UN in California when I was in school. We went to local high school conferences. We took the bus. It was $20, which is low in the United States. And that's how I did Model UN. I did not fly to New York to do these big conferences. I didn't have the opportunity. So it was accessible because I could just commute 20 minutes, go to a conference. But that required the schools in the area to coordinate with each other. SDG 17, I forgot to mention that, private-public partnerships. We need to expand our relationships outside of this room. Here, everyone is nonprofit, government, international, NGO. We're missing SDG 17. The private sector is where the money is at. Why are we not building relationships with them, right? And last point is for sustainability and underprivileged. There's 2 models I've seen that worked really well. One is the train-the-trainer model, specifically teachers. If they just do 1 week of training, they can deliver a lifetime of value to their school. That's all it takes, just 1 week. The other model is if you want student leaders to lead instead, it usually takes around 3 years of repeat training for student leaders because they turn over faster, right? So the most successful model I have seen is with Northeast India International Model UN in Nagaland, India. Their youth delegate came to one of Bill's trainings when he was at the UN. She brought Best Delegate to Northeast India. We delivered trainings for the first few years, trained their students, and I just visited this past November, their 10th year anniversary, and they're able to run it mostly on their own now because they had those trainers. I forgot to explain, Nagaland is a place that is rural, indigenous. It is not a wealthy area by any means, very underprivileged. Most of the issues actually relevant, like we discussed in Model UN, actually relevant to their lives. So that is one of the most examples of if you're looking for a model of a community that figured out how to bring Model UN to underprivileged. It is not them coming to New York. It is bringing the resources to them, investing them for several years. UNIC, UNDP India, just get funding for a couple years and then they're good forever. So that's some sustainability.
I want to thank our esteemed panel. I think they contributed a lot to our conversation. 3 quick points. Internships. It is the case that certain parts of the UN are starting to offer internships. ILO is one of them. The WHO is another part of the UN system, UNHCR. So these things are starting to appear in the UN system. So it's not the case that internships throughout the UN system are not being paid. There's been more involvement now with the UN in Model UN. We have UNHCR that has the Model UN Challenge now every year. We're organizing a conference for WHO every year at their headquarters. ILO is also becoming much more involved in Model UN, as we heard, but in Geneva as well. And then lastly, about the consensus thing, we can speak a little bit more about that, but the things that we do in our conference, most of the time is spent in informal consultations where there are no rules of procedure. So there's no limitations on how long you could speak. You can speak as often as you want to whoever you want during that, and most of the conference is in informal consultations. We find that over time, students become much more confident because they have more time to engage in public speaking than you do in traditional Model UN. We also include other aspects. We do press stakeouts, which is a very exciting kind of thing. We introduce things that you generally don't see in Model UN because they've evolved. We do the ARIA formula when we do the Security Council. These are things that are not traditionally known. I will stop here. We could talk more about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill. And thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. Now, this panel does feed itself quite quickly into a workshop. And as you can see behind you, there are 6 tables. There were 4. We've dragged in 2 in the meantime. And we have 6 facilitators, 3, some of which are already here, and 3 are there to discuss 6 topics with you. So if I can just very quickly tap the screen. No, the other way. There we are. No, it's okay. So we have 6 topics and 6 tables here. Now, obviously, we are running with a delay. So we will just have each group just discuss the topic they started with. We're not going to rotate necessarily, which was the original plan. But the 6 are the following. Topic 1 is access to Model United Nations, and that will be facilitated by Kevin Chan over here, who you've heard from. Topic 2 will be on MUN cooperation with international organizations and governments, and that will be with Sharon Lowe, who is our wonderful colleague at the back. Topic 3, diversity and inclusion in Model UN. That is Anna Williamson, who's over there on table 3. Topic 4, sharing resources and building skills for delegates. That is Sahith over here. Topic 5 is organizing conferences, and that'll be with Caitlin. And finally, topic 6 is partnership between MUNs, and that is with Chase over there. I do want to say, online, this workshop is running too. So we have a hybrid workshop, which has been complicated, but we're making it happen. And I want to give a big shout out to Laura Beth, who's joining us online, and Tobias, who are facilitating the workshops there, along with the rest of our staff. So all that's left is to thank the panelists once again. If you want to stay, you're welcome to. I understand you're probably busy though. And otherwise, all of you, please get up. Please go to the tables where you were assigned. Honestly, if there's a topic that you find more interesting you weren't assigned to, please go there. We'll split up roughly into groups of 6, and then we'll get started. So thank you.